Chen Wei had always believed his fists could solve any problem. At 28, he stood as the undefeated champion of 3 underground fighting circuits across Southeast Asia. His reputation preceded him. Wherever he went, a man whose kicks could shatter concrete blocks and whose punches moved faster than most people could blink. The small kingdom of Valdoria had never seen anything like him. Nestled between towering mountains and pristine lakes, this peaceful nation had maintained its traditions for over 800 years. Tourism was their main income, and visitors came from around the world to witness the changing of the guard ceremony at the royal palace. Chen arrived in Valdoria's capital city on a Tuesday morning, stepping off the bus with nothing but a worn leather bag and an ego the size of a mountain. He had heard stories about this place, how the royal guards were supposedly the finest warriors in the region, trained in ancient combat techniques passed down through generations. To Chen, these were just fairy tales told to impress tourists. The city streets buzzed with activity as vendors sold handmade crafts and locals went about their daily routines. Children played in the cobblestone squares while elderly people sat on benches, feeding pigeons and sharing stories. Everything about this place seemed soft and peaceful to Chen, which only reinforced his belief that the stories about their warriors were greatly exaggerated. By afternoon, Chen had made his way to the royal palace. The building rose majestically against the blue sky, its white marble walls gleaming in the sunlight. Golden spires reached toward the clouds, and intricate carvings told stories of the kingdom's proud history. Hundreds of tourists gathered in the main courtyard, cameras ready to capture the famous ceremony. At exactly 3 o'clock, the massive oak doors of the palace opened. 6 royal guards emerged in perfect formation, their movements synchronized like a well-rehearsed dance. They wore deep blue uniforms with gold braiding, and each carried a ceremonial sword at their side. Their faces remained expressionless as they took their positions around the courtyard. The crowd fell silent, mesmerized by the display of discipline and precision. Each guard stood perfectly still, their backs straight and eyes focused straight ahead. Even the children stopped playing to watch these impressive figures who seemed carved from stone. Chen observed from the back of the crowd, his arms crossed and a smirk playing on his lips. He had seen military ceremonies before, and to him, this was nothing more than a show for tourists. These men looked strong, but Chen doubted they had ever faced a real opponent in actual combat. Their movements were too clean, too practiced, too safe. As the ceremony continued, Chen's confidence grew. He had defeated seasoned fighters in underground rings where there were no rules and no mercy. He had faced opponents twice his size and walked away victorious. What could these palace guards possibly know about real fighting? The crowd began to disperse as the ceremony concluded, but Chen remained in place. He watched as the guards prepared to return to their posts, their formation still perfect despite the growing number of tourists trying to take pictures with them. Most of the guards politely declined photo requests, maintaining their professional composure. One guard, however, caught Chen's attention. He appeared to be the leader of the group, standing slightly taller than the others with silver threading on his uniform indicating higher rank. His name was Captain Marcus, though Chen did not know this yet. Marcus had served the royal guard for 15 years, rising through the ranks not just because of his fighting skills, but because of his wisdom and dedication to protecting the royal family. Chen studied Marcus's stance and noticed something that others missed. Beneath the ceremonial uniform and formal posture, there was something different about this man. His balance was perfect, his breathing controlled, and despite standing motionless for over an hour, he showed no signs of fatigue. Still, Chen's arrogance blinded him to these subtle signs of a true warrior. As the last tourists filtered out of the courtyard, Chen made his decision. He would challenge one of these guards to prove that their reputation was nothing more than marketing for tourists. In his mind, it would be an easy victory that would add another story to his collection of conquests. The sun began to set behind the palace walls, casting long shadows across the courtyard. Soon, Chen would learn that some legends exist for very good reasons, and that true strength often comes in forms that arrogance cannot recognize. The next morning brought clear skies and the sound of church bells echoing through the city. Chen had spent the night in a small hotel near the palace, his mind racing with plans for his upcoming confrontation. He had studied videos of famous fighters online, practiced his most impressive kicks in his hotel room, and even rehearsed what he would say to the media afterward. By 10 o'clock, Chen was back at the palace gates. The morning shift of royal guards had taken their positions and tourists were already gathering for the next ceremony. Chen positioned himself near the front of the crowd this time, wanting to get a closer look at his potential opponents. Captain Marcus stood at his usual post near the main entrance, his presence commanding respect from both visitors and fellow guards. Chen studied him more carefully now, noting the way Marcus's eyes constantly scanned the crowd, alert for any potential threats. This was not the behavior of a mere ceremonial figure, but Chen's pride prevented him from seeing the warning signs. As the morning progressed, Chen grew impatient. He had come here to prove a point, not to watch endless parades of tourists taking pictures. Finally, during a brief break between ceremonies, Chen saw his opportunity. Most of the guards had stepped back to allow maintenance workers to clean the courtyard, leaving only Marcus and one other guard at their posts. Chen approached Marcus with the swagger of a man who had never truly been defeated. The few tourists remaining in the area sensed something unusual happening and began to gather at a respectful distance, their cameras ready but their expressions uncertain. "Excuse me," Chen called out in English, knowing that most palace staff spoke multiple languages for the tourists. "I've heard stories about how skilled the royal guards are supposed to be. I'm curious if those stories are actually true." Marcus turned slightly to face Chen, his expression remaining neutral and professional. "The royal guard serves to protect the royal family and maintain the peace of our kingdom," he replied calmly. "We are honored that visitors take interest in our traditions." Chen's smirk widened. The guard's diplomatic response only confirmed his suspicions that these men were more concerned with public relations than actual fighting ability. "I mean real skill," Chen pressed. "Combat skill. Fighting skill. Not just marching around in fancy uniforms." The other tourists began to murmur among themselves, sensing the tension building in the courtyard. Marcus remained perfectly still, but Chen noticed a slight change in the guard's posture. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but suddenly Marcus seemed more grounded, more centered. "Our training includes many disciplines," Marcus replied, his voice still calm but carrying a new undertone that Chen was too arrogant to recognize. "We are prepared for whatever duties our service may require." Chen took a step closer, his voice growing louder. "Where I come from, we settle questions about fighting ability in a very direct way. I've defeated champions across 3 countries. I could probably take on your entire guard unit." The courtyard fell silent except for the distant sound of traffic from the city streets. Even the pigeons seemed to sense the change in atmosphere and took flight from their perches around the fountain. Marcus's fellow guard moved slightly, positioning himself where he could assist if needed, but Marcus held up one hand in a barely visible gesture that told his colleague to wait. "You seem to be a visitor to our kingdom," Marcus said, his tone still respectful, but now carrying a weight that made several tourists take involuntary steps backward. "We welcome all guests who come in peace and respect our customs." Chen laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the marble walls. "Peace and customs won't help you in a real fight. I bet none of you have ever faced someone with actual combat experience. You're just here to look pretty for the cameras." Marcus studied Chen for a long moment, taking in everything from the young man's stance to the way he held his hands. Years of training had taught Marcus to read opponents instantly, and what he saw was a fighter with genuine skill, but dangerous overconfidence. This was exactly the type of person who could hurt innocent bystanders if not handled properly. "If you're interested in martial arts," Marcus said carefully, "there are several schools in the city that offer classes and demonstrations. I would be happy to provide directions." But Chen was beyond reasoning now. The guard's continued politeness felt like mockery to him, and the growing crowd of onlookers had him feeling like he was on stage. This was his moment to prove that real fighters were superior to ceremonial soldiers. "I don't need directions to a school," Chen declared, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "I need someone brave enough to show me what Valdorian fighting looks like. Unless, of course, you're all just for show." Marcus exchanged a brief glance with his fellow guard, a silent communication that spoke of years working together. The situation was escalating beyond what diplomacy could handle, and Marcus knew that sometimes the best way to prevent a larger conflict was to address a smaller one directly. The captain took one step forward, and suddenly Chen felt as if the entire world had shifted around him. The change in Marcus was immediate and undeniable. Where moments before had stood a ceremonial guard maintaining diplomatic courtesy, now stood a warrior whose very presence seemed to alter the air pressure in the courtyard. Chen felt it but didn't understand what he was experiencing. His underground fighting experience had never prepared him for someone who carried such quiet, controlled power. "Very well," Marcus said, his voice carrying a new authority that made even the distant conversations of tourists fade to whispers. "If you insist on this demonstration, we can accommodate your request.
However, I must warn you that our methods may differ from what you're accustomed to." Chen's excitement peaked.
Finally, he would get the chance to prove his superiority over these palace pretenders. He began to remove his jacket, rolling his shoulders and loosening up his muscles in preparation for what he assumed would be an easy victory. "I'll try to go easy on you," Chen announced to the growing crowd, his voice full of false modesty. "I don't want to embarrass your kingdom's reputation too badly." Marcus simply nodded and took 3 steps backward, creating a natural fighting space in the center of the courtyard. He didn't remove any part of his uniform, didn't stretch or warm up, didn't even change his breathing pattern. To Chen, this seemed like proof that the guard was unprepared for serious combat. The crowd had grown considerably now. Word was spreading through the palace that something unusual was happening, and both tourists and local staff were gathering to watch. Chen loved having an audience. Every victory was sweeter when people witnessed his dominance. "Are you ready?" Chen called out, bouncing slightly on his feet as he settled into his fighting stance. He had chosen his most intimidating posture, one that had psychologically defeated many opponents before the fighting even began. Marcus responded by simply standing naturally, his hands relaxed at his sides, his feet positioned normally. To everyone watching, it looked like he was completely unprepared to defend himself. Chen's confidence soared. Without warning, Chen launched his attack. He had planned this moment carefully, choosing his most devastating technique to end the fight quickly and spectacularly. His right leg swept up in a powerful roundhouse kick aimed directly at Marcus's head. It was a kick that had knocked out 3 opponents in his last tournament, a strike that moved with incredible speed and force. What happened next would be discussed in the kingdom for years to come. Marcus didn't block the kick in any conventional sense. He didn't step backward or raise his arms defensively. Instead, he moved forward and slightly to his left, his body flowing like water around Chen's attacking leg. At the same time, his right hand made contact with Chen's knee, not striking it but simply redirecting its energy. Chen's powerful kick, which should have connected with devastating force, instead swept harmlessly through empty air. But the redirection of energy didn't stop there. Marcus's subtle touch had altered the entire trajectory of Chen's attack, causing the young fighter to spin further than intended. Before Chen could recover his balance, Marcus was behind him. The guard's left hand pressed gently against Chen's lower back while his right hand touched the base of Chen's neck. There was no violence in these touches, no harsh strikes or painful grabs. Yet somehow Chen found himself completely unable to move. The martial arts champion, who had dominated underground fighting circuits across 3 countries, was suddenly as helpless as a child. He couldn't turn around, couldn't step forward, couldn't even shift his weight from one foot to the other. Marcus held him in place with what felt like the gentlest pressure, but it was as absolute as if Chen had been encased in concrete. "The demonstration is complete," Marcus announced to the crowd, his voice carrying clearly across the silent courtyard. Traditional Valdorian martial arts focus on control and precision rather than force and destruction. Chen tried to speak, tried to demand his release, but found that even his voice was somehow constrained by whatever technique Marcus was employing. The crowd watched in amazed silence as the boastful fighter stood frozen like a statue, held in place by touches so light they seemed almost gentle. "Our fighting methods," Marcus continued, apparently for the benefit of the tourists who were now frantically taking pictures and videos, were developed over centuries to neutralize threats while minimizing harm to all involved, including the aggressor. For 30 seconds that felt like an eternity to Chen. He remained perfectly immobilized. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the technique was released. Marcus stepped back to his original position, his hands once again relaxed at his sides, his expression returning to its professional neutrality. Chen stumbled forward, his balance completely disrupted. He spun around to face Marcus, his eyes wide with shock and confusion. Never in his fighting career had he encountered anything like what had just happened to him. Chen stood in the center of the courtyard, his mind racing to process what had just occurred. Everything he thought he knew about fighting, about strength, about dominance, had been turned upside down in less than 10 seconds. The crowd around him buzzed with excitement, their cameras and phones capturing every moment of his confusion and humiliation. "What did you do to me?" Chen demanded, his voice cracking slightly as he tried to regain his composure. "What kind of trick was that?" Marcus maintained his professional demeanor, but there was something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Not cruelty or satisfaction, but perhaps a hint of disappointment at Chen's inability to recognize what had truly happened. "There was no trick," Marcus replied calmly. "You requested a demonstration of our fighting techniques. What you experienced was a basic defensive response taught to all royal guards during their first year of training." The words hit Chen like physical blows. A basic technique. First-year training. This man had neutralized his most powerful attack using something so fundamental that it was taught to beginners. Chen's entire identity as an undefeated fighter began to crumble around him. Several tourists approached Marcus with questions about the technique they had witnessed, but the guard politely explained that he needed to return to his duties. The crowd gradually began to disperse, many of them still discussing what they had seen and sharing videos on their phones. Chen remained frozen in place, not from any martial arts technique this time, but from the shock of his first true defeat. He had been beaten so completely, so effortlessly, that he couldn't even understand how it had happened. In underground fighting, victories and defeats were clear-cut. Someone got knocked out, someone couldn't continue, someone gave up. This had been something entirely different. "Wait," Chen called out as Marcus began to move back toward his post. "That's it? You're just going to walk away?" Marcus paused and turned back to face him. "The demonstration you requested has been completed. If you wish to learn more about our martial traditions, I would again recommend visiting one of the local schools." But Chen wasn't ready to accept what had happened. His pride, which had been his greatest strength in previous fights, now became his greatest weakness. Instead of recognizing that he had encountered something beyond his current understanding, he convinced himself that he had simply been caught off guard. "You got lucky," Chen announced loudly, causing some of the departing tourists to stop and turn back. "I wasn't ready. I wasn't expecting that kind of whatever that was. Let's try again, and this time I'll be prepared for your tricks." Marcus studied Chen's face and saw something that concerned him. The young man's eyes held a dangerous intensity, the look of someone whose entire worldview was being threatened. Marcus had seen this before in his years of service. Sometimes people needed to be defeated completely before they could begin to learn. "I do not think that would be wise," Marcus said carefully. "You have experienced our methods. Perhaps it would be better to reflect on what occurred rather than seeking further confrontation." Chen's laugh was bitter and harsh. "Reflect? I think you're afraid that your little trick won't work twice. I've studied hundreds of fighting styles. Whatever you did, I can figure it out and counter it." The remaining crowd sensed that something more was about to happen. Phones came back out, recording devices were readied, and people positioned themselves for better views. Marcus realized that walking away now would likely only escalate the situation. Chen was the type of person who would interpret retreat as weakness and pursue the matter further. More concerning was the growing crowd. If this situation continued to develop, it could create problems for the palace, the tourism industry, and potentially even diplomatic relations if Chen's claims about being a champion were true. Sometimes the best way to end a problem was to address it so thoroughly that it could never arise again. Marcus looked at his fellow guard, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. Then he looked back at Chen, and for the first time, the young fighter saw something in the captain's eyes that made his stomach tighten with unexpected fear. "Very well," Marcus said, his voice taking on a tone that caused the nearby pigeons to take flight once again. "If you insist on a more complete demonstration, I will accommodate your request. However, I want to be very clear about something before we proceed." Marcus took one step closer to Chen, and suddenly the space between them felt charged with electricity. "What you experienced moments ago was indeed a basic technique. What you are about to experience will be considerably more advanced. Are you certain you wish to continue?" Chen's mouth felt dry, but his pride wouldn't let him back down now. Not in front of all these people. Not after being humiliated once already. He nodded, not trusting his voice to remain steady. Marcus moved back to the center of the courtyard, and this time, everything about his posture changed. The ceremonial guard disappeared completely, replaced by something that made Chen's underground fighting experience seem like children playing games. The transformation in Marcus was like watching a mountain decide to move. His breathing shifted to a deeper, more controlled rhythm. His stance widened slightly, becoming more grounded while somehow appearing more fluid. Most unsettling of all, his eyes changed. They became completely focused, seeing not just Chen but every possible movement Chen might make before Chen himself had even thought of them. Chen felt a chill run down his spine, but it was too late to back down now. The crowd had grown even larger, with palace staff joining the tourists to witness what was clearly going to be an extraordinary demonstration. Someone had even called local news, and Chen could see a reporter setting up a camera in the distance. "This time I'm ready for you," Chen announced, though his voice carried less conviction than before. He settled into a different fighting stance, one designed for quick reactions and defensive counters. He had analyzed their first encounter and convinced himself that Marcus had simply used superior positioning and timing. This time Chen would be more careful. Marcus said nothing in response. He simply stood in his new stance and waited. There was no tension in his body, no visible preparation for combat. Yet Chen had the unsettling feeling that he was facing something far more dangerous than any underground fighter he had ever encountered. Chen decided to start more cautiously this time. Instead of his powerful roundhouse kick, he threw a quick jab to test Marcus's reactions. It was a smart strategy, one that had served him well in many previous fights. The jab never reached its target. Marcus moved his head less than an inch to the left, and Chen's punch passed harmlessly by. But as the punch extended, Marcus's right hand came up and made contact with Chen's wrist. Again, it wasn't a strike or a grab, just a gentle touch that somehow redirected Chen's entire attack. Before Chen could process what was happening, Marcus stepped forward and slightly to the right. His left hand touched Chen's elbow while his right hand maintained contact with the wrist. Suddenly, Chen found himself being guided through a complex movement that he hadn't intended to make. It felt like being caught in a gentle whirlpool. Chen's own momentum was being redirected and amplified, causing him to spin in a direction he hadn't planned. He tried to resist, tried to regain control of his movement, but every attempt to change direction only seemed to make Marcus's control more complete. The crowd watched in amazement as Chen was led through what looked like an intricate dance, his body following paths that Marcus determined with the lightest possible touches. Chen was moving fast, spinning and stepping in complex patterns, but none of it was under his own control. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 15 seconds, Marcus guided Chen into a position where the young fighter found himself facing away from the captain. Completely off balance, unable to see where Marcus was or what he might do next. Then Marcus spoke, his voice calm and clear despite the complex movements they had just completed. Traditional Valdorian martial arts teach us that an opponent's strength becomes their weakness when properly redirected. Your speed and power are considerable, but they can be turned against you. Chen tried to turn around to face Marcus, but found that his balance was so disrupted he could barely stand upright. Every time he attempted to pivot, his own momentum carried him in the wrong direction. He felt like a child trying to walk after spinning in circles, except that Marcus had created this disorientation through precise manipulation of Chen's own movements. The second principle, Marcus continued, apparently for the benefit of the mesmerized crowd, is that true control requires no force. When you understand an opponent's intentions before they act, you can guide their actions without opposing them directly. Finally, Chen's balance began to return, and he managed to turn around to face Marcus. What he saw made his blood run cold. Marcus stood exactly where he had been when the encounter started, his breathing normal, his uniform still perfectly neat. He looked as if he had just finished a casual conversation rather than a martial arts demonstration. Chen, by contrast, was breathing heavily, his clothes disheveled, and his hair matted with sweat. He had expended tremendous energy during their encounter, while Marcus had seemed to do nothing more strenuous than guide a dancing partner. "This is impossible," Chen gasped, struggling to catch his breath. "No one can control another person's movements like that." "What are you?" Marcus's expression softened slightly, and for the first time Chen saw something that might have been compassion in the guard's eyes. "I am a student of martial arts just as you are. The difference is that I have had the opportunity to learn from masters who understood that fighting is not about defeating others, but about achieving perfect harmony between intention and action. The crowd erupted in applause, clearly impressed by the demonstration they had witnessed. Several tourists approached Marcus with questions about where they could learn such techniques, while others simply wanted to congratulate him on the beautiful display of skill. Chen stood alone in the center of the courtyard, ignored by the crowd that had gathered to watch his humiliation. For the first time in his adult life, he faced the crushing realization that everything he thought he knew about martial arts was just the beginning of a much larger and more complex world. The news of Chen's encounter with the royal guard spread through the kingdom faster than wildfire. By evening, videos of the confrontation had been shared thousands of times across social media platforms. Local news stations ran stories about the martial arts challenge at the royal palace, and international media picked up the story as an example of traditional fighting arts still thriving in the modern world. Chen spent that night in his hotel room, staring at the ceiling and replaying the day's events over and over in his mind. Every time he thought about what had happened, he discovered new layers of humiliation that he hadn't initially processed. Not only had he been defeated, but he had been defeated so gently, so effortlessly, that it barely qualified as a fight at all. The worst part was the videos. Chen's friends from the underground fighting circuit had already started sending him links with messages ranging from concerned to mocking. His reputation as an undefeated champion was now permanently shattered, replaced by footage of him being led around like a confused child by a palace guard who never even broke a sweat. Sleep came eventually, but it was filled with dreams of spinning endlessly through space while invisible hands guided his movements in directions he couldn't predict or control. Chen woke up more exhausted than when he had gone to bed, his body aching as if he had actually been fighting all night. The next morning brought an unexpected knock at his hotel room door. Chen opened it to find a young woman in simple robes, her posture radiating the same calm confidence he had seen in Marcus. She introduced herself as Lin, a student at the Valdorian Martial Arts Academy, and explained that Captain Marcus had sent her with an invitation. "The captain believes you might benefit from understanding more about our traditions," Lin explained as Chen reluctantly invited her in. "He has arranged for you to observe some training sessions at our academy if you're interested." Chen's first instinct was to refuse. The last thing he wanted was more humiliation in front of Valdorian martial artists, but something in Lin's manner, a complete absence of mockery or condescension, made him pause. She spoke to him as if he were a fellow student of the arts rather than the arrogant fool he had proven himself to be. "Why would he do that?" Chen asked suspiciously. "I challenged him publicly. I disrespected your entire tradition. Why would any of you want to help me?" Lin smiled, and Chen was surprised to see genuine warmth in her expression. "Captain Marcus said you have genuine skill and passion for martial arts. He believes that with proper guidance you could become something much greater than you currently are. Our tradition teaches that everyone deserves the opportunity to grow beyond their mistakes." Against his better judgment, Chen found himself agreeing to visit the academy. Perhaps it was curiosity about the techniques that had so thoroughly defeated him, or perhaps it was simply the first kind treatment he had received since his public humiliation. Either way, an hour later he was walking through the gates of an ancient building, nestled in the hills above the city. The Valdorian Martial Arts Academy looked nothing like the gyms and training facilities Chen was accustomed to. The buildings were constructed of the same white stone as the royal palace, with gardens and meditation areas scattered throughout the complex. Students moved between training halls with quiet purpose, their conversations hushed and respectful. Lin led Chen to an outdoor training area where a class was in progress. About 20 students of various ages practiced forms that looked more like dance than fighting. Their movements flowed together in perfect harmony, each person's actions complementing those around them, rather than competing for dominance. "This is our foundation class," Lin explained as they watched from a respectful distance. "Students spend 2 years learning to move in harmony with themselves before they begin partner training." Chen watched in fascination as the students performed techniques that appeared simple but felt profoundly complex. There were no powerful strikes, no devastating kicks, no aggressive movements at all. Yet something about their practice radiated strength and purpose that Chen's underground fighting had never possessed. "Where are the fighting techniques?" Chen asked, confusion evident in his voice. "When do they learn to actually defeat opponents?" Lin's smile contained the same patient wisdom Chen had seen in Marcus. "You are seeing fighting techniques. What you witnessed yesterday was the result of decades of training that began exactly like what you see here. Captain Marcus learned to defeat you by first learning to defeat his own impatience, his own ego, his own desire to use force when precision would suffice. As Chen watched the students continue their practice, he began to understand something that challenged everything he had believed about martial arts. These people weren't training to hurt others or prove their superiority. They were training to become better versions of themselves, and their fighting ability was simply a natural result of that personal development. Could I? Chen started to ask, then stopped, embarrassed by his own presumption. Could you what? Lin prompted gently. Could someone like me ever learn to do what Captain Marcus did yesterday? Lin studied Chen's face for a long moment, seeing past his arrogance to the genuine desire for understanding that lay beneath. Anyone can learn our arts, she said finally. But first they must be willing to forget everything they think they already know about fighting. Are you prepared to do that? 6 months later, Chen knelt in the same courtyard where his world had been turned upside down. But this time he wasn't there as a challenger or a tourist. He wore the simple training robes of a beginning student at the Valdorian Martial Arts Academy, and his head was bowed in respect as Captain Marcus approached. The transformation in Chen had been gradual but profound. The first weeks at the academy had been the most difficult of his life. Unlearning years of aggressive fighting habits proved far more challenging than mastering new techniques. His instructors had to break down his understanding of strength, speed, and victory before they could begin building something new in its place. "Rise, student Chen," Marcus said formally, though there was warmth in his voice that hadn't been present during their first encounter. "Today marks 6 months of your training. According to academy tradition, it is time for your progress evaluation." Chen stood slowly, his movements now carrying the fluid grace that came from months of practicing the foundational forms. The angry, arrogant fighter who had challenged the royal guard was gone, replaced by someone who understood that true strength came from harmony rather than dominance. A small crowd had gathered to watch the evaluation, including Lin and several other students who had become Chen's friends during his time at the academy. Unlike the gawking tourists who had witnessed his humiliation, these people were here to support and encourage his growth. "For your evaluation," Marcus continued, "you will demonstrate the 7 flowing rivers form, followed by a partner exercise with student Lin. Remember, we are not judging your ability to defeat an opponent, but your ability to achieve harmony with yourself and others." Chen nodded and moved to the center of the courtyard. As he began the form, his mind went back to that first day when he had watched students practicing movements that seemed too gentle to be effective. Now he understood that these forms were building something far more powerful than muscular strength or aggressive techniques. Each movement of the 7 flowing rivers connected to the next, like water finding its natural path down a mountainside. Chen's breathing remained calm and controlled throughout the complex sequence, his balance perfect even during the most challenging transitions. When he completed the form, he felt the same centered peace that had once seemed impossible to achieve. "Excellent," Marcus observed. "Now please demonstrate defensive principles with student Lin." Lin approached and took a position facing Chen. Without warning, she launched a quick attack toward his midsection. 6 months ago, Chen would have tried to block forcefully or counterattack immediately. Instead, he moved slightly to one side and gently redirected Lin's strike using the same principles Marcus had demonstrated on him. Lin continued with a series of attacks, each one faster and more complex than the last. Chen responded to each with flowing movements that turned her aggression into harmless energy, never once using force to oppose force. To the watching students, it looked like an intricate dance performed by partners who could read each other's intentions perfectly. When the demonstration ended, both Chen and Lin bowed to each other and then to Marcus. The captain nodded approvingly before addressing the small crowd that had gathered. "Student Chen began his training with us after learning that his previous understanding of martial arts was incomplete," Marcus announced. "Today he has demonstrated that true strength comes not from defeating others, but from achieving perfect control over oneself." Marcus turned to face Chen directly. "Your evaluation is complete, and you have passed to the next level of training. However, I believe the most important lesson you have learned is not about fighting techniques, but about the person you have become." Chen felt tears forming in his eyes as he realized how profoundly his life had changed. The man who had arrived in Valdoria seeking to prove his superiority had discovered something infinitely more valuable: the humility to keep learning and growing. "Captain Marcus," Chen said, his voice thick with emotion, "I owe you an apology that is 6 months overdue. When I challenged you, I thought I was testing your skills. I realize now that you were showing me mercy by responding with such restraint." Marcus smiled, and Chen saw approval in his eyes. "No apology is necessary, Student Chen. Your challenge that day was exactly what it needed to be, a moment of learning for both of us. I learned that our traditions still have the power to transform lives, and you learned that there are always deeper levels of understanding to discover." The crowd of students began to disperse, but Lin remained behind with Chen and Marcus. As the sun began to set over the palace walls, casting the same long shadows that had witnessed Chen's humiliation 6 months earlier, the 3 martial artists stood together in comfortable silence. "What happens now?" Chen asked, looking around the courtyard that held such powerful memories for him. "I feel like I'm finally beginning to understand what martial arts really means. But I also feel like I've only taken the first step on a very long journey." "That feeling never goes away," Marcus replied with a chuckle. "I have been studying these arts for over 20 years, and each day I discover something new about myself or about the principles we practice. The difference is that now you understand that the journey itself is the destination." Lin nodded in agreement. "When you first arrived at the academy, you asked when you would learn to defeat opponents like Captain Marcus had defeated you. Do you remember what I told you?" Chen smiled at the memory. "You said I was already seeing fighting techniques, but I was too focused on force to recognize them. I thought you were speaking in riddles, but now I understand. The real victory isn't over other people, it's over your own limitations." "Exactly," Marcus said, "and that victory is never final. It must be earned again each day through practice, patience, and the willingness to remain humble in the face of how much we still don't know." As darkness began to fall over the kingdom, Chen made a decision that would have seemed impossible 6 months ago. Instead of planning his return to the underground fighting circuits to reclaim his reputation, he chose to stay in Valdoria and continue his studies at the academy. The young man who had arrived seeking to prove his superiority had found something far more valuable: a path toward becoming the best version of himself. And in a kingdom known for its peaceful traditions and ancient wisdom, Chen finally understood that the greatest victories were won not in defeating others, but in conquering the arrogance and ignorance within oneself. Years later, when Chen had become an instructor at the academy himself, he would often tell new students about his first encounter with Captain Marcus. He would describe how a single moment of humility had changed the entire course of his life, transforming him from a fighter who sought to dominate others into a teacher who helped others discover their own potential for growth. The story of the martial arts star who challenged the royal guard became legend in Valdoria, not because of the spectacular defeat, but because of the beautiful transformation that followed. It served as a reminder that sometimes the most devastating losses become the foundation for the most meaningful victories, and that true strength reveals itself not in how powerfully you can strike, but in how gracefully you can learn from your mistakes.